On February 19th, in the city of Calgary, Alberta, Canada, a city with which I'm quite familiar, a city in which I have friends and family, a tragedy occurred that should have made headlines around the world, should have shaken people to the core and made people reconsider the institutions upon which our society believes itself to be founded. On this day, South Sudanese Canadian Latjor Tuel was shot to death by police on the street of a major commercial district. Let me tell you the story of what happened, according to the police report. I'll be paraphrasing, but I want to give you this story from the perspective of the people that this video obviously is suggesting should lose their jobs, and the institution that should be dismantled. I want to be as fair as possible to my viewers, both those who agree and those who would disagree with me here. In the afternoon of February 19th, 2022, police were called to an assault. It is important, they point out, to recognize that this is what they were called to. Not a mental health check, but an assault. They were told that there was a man waving a large stick around and a knife, and that he had struck somebody with the stick. When police arrived, Latjor was still in possession of both items, and he was surrounded by police, including a police dog. Latjor became agitated, and he lunged at the police dog. The dog was pulled back. When he could not be de-escalated, police fired rubber rounds at him, but Latjor lashed out at them. The police then escalated to attempting to use their stun batons on Latjor, at which point he stabbed the police dog who was lunging at him. A side note to those animal lovers out there, the dog is just fine. However, police then fired 4 live rounds into Latjor's body, who died at the scene. Eyewitnesses report that the body was still at the scene 6 hours later. Apart from that final sentence, this is the blow-by-blow account given by police. Now, the question I'd like you to ask yourself is, what are your immediate impressions of the situation? What kind of man do you think Latjor is? What do you think might have been going on? And based on that, what do you think the best response would have been? I brought this question to a number of my friends, and of course, they know me, they know my positions, they know what I do for a living, and generally they agree with me about these things, as friends tend to do. That having been said, they suggested to me that he might have been on a drug, particularly perhaps a dissociative or a strong stimulant. They suggested he might be having a mental health episode, perhaps a psychotic episode, maybe re-experiencing trauma. I had others suggest that the police might have been lying, and while I can appreciate that level of pessimism, I'm going to give the police the benefit of the doubt and assume that their report is truthful. But regardless, everyone agreed that this was not a situation which required a police dog, and it was not a situation that needs to have resulted in this man's death. I hope that my entire audience, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum, can agree with this at least. I'd like you to take a moment and consider what might have been going on and what the response should have been. Had your moment? All right. If you took your moment to consider that Latjor Tuel might have been a criminal of some kind, might have had a history, I'd like to say right off the bat that you are incorrect. Latjor was loved by his community. He was known as a very generous, kind, and calm person, but one who was struggling with mental health issues. In particular, post-traumatic stress from his formative years being spent as a child soldier in South Sudan, from which he arrived to Canada with refugee status. I can't find any indication that he was a drug abuser or that he had a criminal record. He was simply a man having a very bad day, one that most of us couldn't even begin to comprehend. A bad day amplified by flashbacks to his childhood spent being literally enslaved to kill and potentially be killed in the Civil War with the greatest civilian death toll in world history. But the police would like it to be known that they were called to an assault, and they dealt with it like they would an assault. Because an assault and a mental health call are entirely different things. And if the man in question is waving around a stick and a knife on a main street, that still counts as an assault. Now, if you're sitting here wondering, well, what else could they do? Police are trained to de-escalate violent situations through violent means, and they have to consider their own safety. No one really could have done better without compromising that, right? Wrong. That's wrong. That's completely wrong. And I know that's wrong because that's what I do as part of my job. I de-escalate violent situations completely unarmed, unarmored, and without doing so much as laying a hand on the escalated individual. More than that, I am consulted by teams employed to produce wraparound treatments for identified high-risk people to lift them up out of the crack they've fallen through, including housing, addictions treatment, cultural awareness, one-to-one support, financial supports, and mental health supports, just to name a few broad services. If I get called into a violent situation, I isolate the situation first and foremost. Prevent public access. I establish communication with the individual in a caring way, which is the opposite, incidentally, of how police are trained. You'll notice, if you're ever approached by police, they keep their hand at their belt, giving the impression of power and the ability and willingness to escalate the situation to violence if necessary. We keep our hands to our sides, and our shoulders checked instead of squared in order to reduce the intimidation factor, while still allowing us to move and protect ourselves if necessary. And for me personally, I establish rapport. I'm good at mirroring, which is a cognitive technique in which you mimic social markers of an individual's communication. Things like idiolect, gestures, level of eye contact, facial expressions. And using that rapport, explore the situation with the individual with the goal of de-escalation. Following an incident, instead of having investigative units toss the guy's place and maybe rough him up a little, we have multidisciplinary caseworkers set to determine and address the identified problems. In this case, they would speak with the individual, any professional contacts, as well as family, friends, community members, to get a picture of what's going on in their life, along with identifying any physical, environmental, and social aspects of their environment that may be contributing. Maybe poverty was a contributing factor. Financial insecurity is a leading cause of mental illness. Maybe there are cultural aspects, or an abusive family dynamic that needs to be given attention. And maybe, it turns out our individual is suffering severe PTSD from childhood experiences that their community can actually play a part in supporting him with. This system isn't perfect, mind you. It all sounds excellent on paper, but in my experience fails because of the model of profit and liability. They're all conducted ultimately by companies who want the funding to keep coming in, and if the funding stops or an activity would be too high risk and potentially jeopardize that funding, then so ends the individualized treatment. I could talk your ear off about this, but that's not what this video is about. This video wants to ask you the question, what if it weren't for profit? What if it were, say, wholly government funded, not reliant upon donations, without competition or the need for competition, without unnecessary liability in order to keep the funding flowing? You know, kind of like the police are right now. What if we did that and just abolished the police? Not defunded, abolished, got rid of entirely. What if we abolished the police? Wait, did I just say abolished? Not defund? Wait, Comrade Ferret, I thought by abolish you meant defund. We can't just get rid of the police, can we? Let's not be quite so severe. Maybe we can just reform the police, give them sensitivity training maybe, training to deal with mental health crises. Maybe there's bad guys at the top we should get rid of. It's always bad guys at the top causing the problems, right? I mean, in this case, a little bit. The cops are corrupt up at the top, that's for sure. And there are plenty of instances of really egregious political meddling in all the wrong ways. Take Edmonton, for example. Edmonton is a city just around 300 kilometers north of Calgary. During the whole Freedom Convoy occupation, City Councillor Michael Jans, quite rightfully, was calling for Edmonton police services to be held accountable for their inaction and sometimes their very apparent support of the highly disruptive, fascist, racist protests occurring for 3 weeks in the political center of the city. While trucks were content to blare their horns at all hours of the day and block up streets and fly racist and violent slogans, counter-protesters would be quickly, physically assaulted, broken up, and arrested. Jans had a problem with this. And Edmonton Police Association President Michael Elliott had a problem with him having a problem with this, and implied in a tweet that I can't find because I don't use Twitter. I don't even know how Twitter works. I don't give enough of a crap, but I did reference a source that references it down in the description. He'd implied in a tweet that attempts to hold Edmonton Police Service accountable for their obvious negligence and support of fascist occupiers might just result in a reduction in police emergency response. Basically, threatening to not do their job if they're called to task for ignoring and exacerbating an issue that was at the time completely overtaking the entire Canadian media to the point that other, much more important news like, say, the murder of a black man by police, would go entirely unnoticed. This sort of thing happens a lot, and it's no coincidence that the slogan Blue Lives Matter only arose in direct response to the Black Lives Matter movement. If they're going to support or be supported by a movement, police institutions err towards the far right, and it happens frequently enough that I don't think I need to spend a whole lot more time on this topic. But bringing up Blue Lives Matter brings me to the issues even on the front lines of police. Blue culture is very real, and there are whole books on the subject. Start with Googling around about a phenomenon called the Blue Wall of Silence. in which, in the case that a police officer does something, wrong and evil, their fellows will outright perjure themselves in order to support them. This also works the other way, though. Ever wonder where, with all the bad apples, the good cops have all gone? Why do we never hear about the good cops? Well, it's because the good cops don't last. As soon as you out yourself as someone who's going to stand up against the violent racists in your occupation, you're pushed out. That's blue culture. But, I hear reformers say, what about a radical restructuring? What if we got rid of all the bad cops? What if we could just enact more stringent hiring practices and make the police liberal? Well, unfortunately, that just isn't a thing that can happen. Even if you waved a magic wand and purged all the racists and horrible people from police ranks, they'd just come right back. Kind of like if you put a white sheet on a boomerang. I'll be doing a video about this phenomenon in general in the future, but for now, let me just say, there's a very high ratio of police officers who are themselves psychopaths. Individuals neurologically incapable of feeling empathy that trend towards patterns of manipulation, power-seeking, and violence. And the police structure is built on a monopoly of violence and systemic control over the civilian population. So yeah, of course it has a heck of a lot of psychopaths. And of course psychopaths are going to support extremely hierarchical ideas that give them more power. It's no coincidence that blue culture is real. No coincidence that there are so many bad apples. The tree itself is rotten. Let me say right now, there is not a single crime that is committed that is not due completely and wholly to psychological, economic, and sociocultural factors. There are no factors that lie outside of those three categories that exist as the material causes of crime. And none of these factors are aided by beating up and imprisoning the offenders, and certainly not by killing them. Let me tell you, I work daily with shoplifters, carjackers, rapists, murderers, child molesters, the whole dang spectrum, and there isn't a single one of them that cannot live a normal, productive life within society, given the proper supports. But now, I hear the right wing ask, who's going to pay for those supports? What's all that going to cost? Well, what does the police cost, I wonder? Canada spent $15.7 billion on policing in 2019 out of a total budget of $355.6 billion. That's a little over 22.6% of the entire federal budget of that year. That pays for things that social workers and other relevant professionals need, like infrastructure, transportation, training, but it also pays for the armor, weaponry, special fancy bulletproof vehicles, and other tools of violence that simply wouldn't be needed. It also pays for prisons and courts, which are going to be more expensive than professional meetings and consultations, and the occasional in-home support utilizing the empty housing in this country that outnumbers the homeless. So it isn't a question of who will pay for this, it's what will we do with the money we save by, again, abolishing the police? What will we do with the better economy brought about by having a larger workforce, by enabling the disadvantaged and addressing systemic issues like poverty and racial disparity? Well, we could do more. We could work with communities and perform better research upon the factors leading to crime and address them head on. This has been referred to as community policing, which, although application remains rare, has been highly successful in accomplishing identified goals of enhancing community trust of police and reducing local crime. For reasons addressed earlier, it isn't enough. Community policing is a nod to a better system, but it is still ultimately the same system. It's still hierarchical, it still relies upon a monopoly of violence. However, its philosophy is the hallmark of properly applied social support. And with the money saved by abolishing the police, we could crank it up to 11 and start really addressing some gosh dang local and systemic issues. What's the downside? Well, none, really. This is what we progressives mean when we rally against the police, the very concept of the police. We aren't looking for anarchy and chaos, we're looking at community supports. We're looking at applied research. We're looking for human beings to be treated like human beings. The only downside is to the strict hierarchy in which we live. It's in the removal of one aspect of the fear we have for the people above us. This fact is shown in how little coverage Latjor Tuel's story has gotten, how it's been completely overshadowed even in Calgary itself by the goddamn Freedom Convoy, and for that reason alone, it will never happen. The police will never be abolished. we will never get the equality, the supports, the freedom, and the safety we all deserve as human beings. Not unless we take it.